There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
There are no inventions without a pedigree, meaning that nothing is developed in complete isolation. An inventor always draws on the work of others that have gone before.
Those words were from the inventor of the light bulb. And no, I'm not talking about Thomas Edison. I'm talking about Joseph Swan. Joseph Swan was an English inventor who came up with a working light bulb months before Thomas Edison did. Edison, however, was a much more resourceful businessman, and he poured his money into patents and an advertising campaign which pretty much assured that his name would be forever linked with the light bulb. Swan, being a more modest man but no less driven, agreed to join forces with Edison. The resulting company was called the Edison and Swan United Electric Light Company, commonly known at the time as Ediswan. Today, if I were to stop 10 people on the street and ask them who invented the light bulb, I would wager that those who had any idea at all would say Thomas Edison. I would bet even more that not a single one would utter the name Joseph Swan. I would also raise the stakes and say that even if I mentioned the name Joseph Swan, they wouldn't know who I was talking about. This is the sad part of history. Some names bubble to the surface and are carried along the waves of time for years or even centuries. Some ride the wave for a moment, hit a crest, and sink below the waves, never to be heard of again. If history is one large book, they are but a footnote. And with each new edition, some footnotes are edited out. Fortunately for Joseph Swan, he is a little bit more than a footnote. But his page should be much larger when it's compared to the page of Thomas Edison, at least as far as the light bulb is concerned. But it's not. Today we are going to talk about another man whom I would bet many have never heard of, and shamefully so. His name is Alfred Russel Wallace. You might be nodding your head because you've been following this show from the beginning and I've mentioned him before, or you may be a student of science who happens to be interested in evolution. If that's the case, then you're sure to have heard of him. Unfortunately, outside of this show or those interested in the subject, many would have no idea who I am talking about. Mention evolution and one name comes up: Charles Darwin. Darwin deserves to come up, but so does Alfred Wallace. There was a time very early on and for a few decades that the theory of evolution by natural selection was attributed to both Darwin and Wallace. Wallace is now a footnote. Perhaps it's his own doing, for he did publish a book in 1889 called Darwinism. Assigning much of the credit to Darwin doesn't mean that he doesn't deserve almost an equal share. We all fear that at the end of our lives, we'll be forever forgotten and sink below the waves of time, never to be heard of again. It's one of the reasons why I write. Perhaps it's the only reason. I'm certainly not doing it for the money, although that would be nice. I write because I want to leave a mark to show that I was here, to show that I had thoughts and interests and that I wanted to share them. I want to matter, at least to some, and hopefully not only to myself. And I wonder if this is how Wallace felt at times. History reports that he was extremely grateful to Darwin for his support, and he by no means had any reason for animosity. In fact, the two men enjoyed a long-lasting friendship. But I can't help but wonder if, on a cold night while sitting by the fire with a glass of wine or scotch at his side, if he ever wondered, what if, while looking into the flames? What if he had traveled to London and sought to present and publish his ideas as his own, or on his own? Surely the thought had occurred to him, but perhaps, being a young man, he lacked the confidence and felt the need for guidance, as a lot of us do at that age. This, after all, is what happened, and that guidance led him into obscurity. Or perhaps not. It seems that Wallace hasn't been forgotten and may even be enjoying somewhat of a resurgence. In January of 2013, an oil painting was unveiled which you can now see at the London Natural History Museum. The painting hangs in sight of Charles Darwin's statue. and in the last 10 years there have been several book-length biographies on him. The next time you run across a footnote, stop and pause for a moment. There might just be something there, like a reference to an almost forgotten naturalist by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace was born in 1813, and he was the seventh of 9 children. His family wasn't rich by any stretch of the imagination, and his parents did the best they could to provide for their children. And eventually, Wallace found a job as a surveyor, and because of this, he was able to spend a good deal of time outside. He was fascinated by nature, and in time, he befriended a young man by the name of Henry Bates. Bates was an entomologist, which means that he liked to study insects. He passed this interest on to Wallace, and Wallace soon found himself collecting beetles. So when he wasn't looking down at his compass while surveying, he was looking at the plants around him for beetles. They fascinated him like nothing else ever had. Wallace's imagination was also captured by the stories he read about naturalists and their travels. One of the books was Charles Darwin's The Voyage of the Beagle. The Voyage of the Beagle was published in 1839 as Journal and Remarks. By 1848, Wallace's mind was made up. He was going to become an adventuring naturalist as well. So both he and Henry Bates took off for Brazil to collect and classify insects and anything else they could find in the dark rainforests and send them back to England. Wallace ended up spending 4 years in the Amazon. He eventually decided it was time to return to England with his specimens and his notes, and hopped on board a ship called Helen. Providence wasn't smiling down on him, and the Helen caught fire during the journey back, and everyone on board was forced to abandon ship. Wallace's specimens and some of his notes, the ones he had been working so hard on to prove himself as a naturalist, were lost. Not to be deterred or to prove that you can't keep a good naturalist down, Wallace spent 8 years traveling through the Malay archipelago, better known as the East Indies, to continue chasing down specimens and noting down his thoughts. Much like Darwin did during his great journey, Wallace began to notice something in the beetles he collected. It's been said that he collected over 80,000 beetles during this time, and of many different species, and some of them were even unknown to anyone at the time. When he began to note the differences in beetle species, he also began to see the similarities. There were features that were unique to one species, which is how one differentiates between different species. But when you begin to put them next to one another, the lines aren't so clear. And this is what Wallace saw. They were still beetles, with many of the same features. They were just slightly different from one another. There were slight modifications. The reason behind these modifications started to come clear after he read a book by Thomas Robert Malthus. That book was an essay on the principle of population.
It occurred to me to ask the question, why do some die and some live?
I say influential because it was this very same book which had served as a gelling agent for Darwin's own thoughts.
And the answer was clearly, on the whole, the best fitted live. And considering the amount of individual variation that my experience as a collector had shown me to exist, then it followed that all the changes necessary for the adaptation of the species to the changing conditions would be brought about. In this way, every part of an animal's organisation could be modified exactly as required. And in the very process of this modification, the unmodified would die out, and thus the definite characters and the clear isolation of each new species would be explained.
Now that his way to the transmutation of species was coming together, Wallace worked up his thoughts into a treatment and sent them to the one man whom he felt would appreciate them, and who could perhaps lend his considerable influence into having that treatment published. And this was in 1858, and it was because of this treatment that Darwin found himself faced with a decision concerning his own work. He had reached the same conclusions after 20 years of work, and here was Alfred Russel Wallace, a man literally working in the field with the very same ideas. So Darwin did what was right, and he presented Wallace's paper alongside his own at a meeting of the Linnean Society. A year later, Darwin would publish On the Origin of Species and introduce the dangerous notion that species evolved and were not created out of whole cloth in their present forms, an evolutionary process that required vast amounts of time, billions of years in fact. After the publication of Darwin's book, Wallace became one of his most vocal defenders. Through lectures and letters, he spread the word about the beauty of natural selection when it came to explaining the life we see around us and its innumerable species. His friendship with Darwin continued, and many of their talks and letters revolved around natural selection and other ideas. And one area where the two men did differ, though, was when it came to sexual selection. This is the power of mating preferences to select for those modifications a potential mate might find appealing, or one that a potential mate is attracted to. Think of peacock males who try to attract females with their plumage. Darwin felt that sexual selection was just as powerful a modifier as was natural selection. Wallace disagreed, and he proposed other alternatives to some of the examples that Darwin gave for sexual selection. Sexual selection was but one area that the two men differed in opinion on. The other was even deeper and more metaphysical. Whereas Darwin's theories did not account for a creator, in fact, they didn't require one at all, Russell thought differently. What troubled Russell was human consciousness. He could not see how evolution or natural selection could account for it. In his opinion, material causes couldn't be responsible for it. For Darwin, there was no purpose in evolution, and the fact that we as human beings have the type of consciousness we have is simply a matter of chance, and one which may be explained at some future date. Wallace shook his head at this notion. For him, there had to be a purpose behind it. In fact, there just might be a purpose behind everything, and mankind might be the focus or the end result of that purpose. Whatever it was that worked behind the scenes to see this purpose brought to fruition, whether it be God or some unseen spirit, Wallace saw evidence of it in three areas. The first was the creation of life from inorganic matter. The second was consciousness, as I mentioned. And the third was the further complexity of consciousness in mankind and mankind alone. It was also around this time that Wallace began to dabble in another area which set him apart from his peers, that being spiritualism. Spiritualism spoke to his ideas that the universe had a driving purpose behind it. All that aside, while important to understand Wallace's ambitions, they didn't deter him from defending evolution by natural selection at every opportunity, even if that selection process was put in place for some unknown reason and by some unknown and perhaps intelligent force. In 1864, Wallace published his own account of human evolution in a paper titled The Origin of Human Races and the Antiquity of Man Deduced from the Theory of Natural Selection. This account came 7 years before Darwin's own thoughts on the matter, when Darwin himself published The Descent of Man. In 1869, Wallace published an account of his travels and adventures in the Malay Archipelago, which went on to become extremely popular. He even dedicated the book to the one person who had inspired him as a young man, that being Charles Darwin, and Darwin was immeasurably pleased at that. Wallace is also notable for giving thoughts to the possibility that there may be life on other planets. In 1904, he published Man's Place in the Universe, and in it he concluded that the Earth was probably the only place that would support life, at least as far as our solar system went, mainly because it was the only planet which had an abundance of water. He even voiced doubt that other systems or galaxies could produce planets like our own, making ours a very special place. Now, if the universe does have a purpose, Wallace reached a milestone of his own on November 7, 1913. He died at home at the ripe old age of 90. The New York Times called him the last of the giants. And what a giant he was. Let it be said that Alfred Russel Wallace's life did have a purpose, and that purpose is still being felt today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Evolution Talk. I'm Rick Coast, and you can find show notes and source material, and also ways to support the show, at evolutiontalk.com. I'd love to hear from you. I hope your week is going well, and until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.